Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We have a great show for you. Timely, it's going to have information. It's going to be a deep dive. It's going to cover things that probably no one else is talking about and are hyper relevant to the moment. I usually take a look at what everyone's talking about, but I don't always respond right away. I kind of look at it from different angles, and then I come up with a unique analysis. We're doing that now. And basically what we're going to argue in today's episode is, in the wake of Charlie Kirk's death, he was assassinated. That is not good for politics. What is the potential for a second civil war? Now, I know when you look at this, it seems, that sensationalist. I'm going to show you how it's not. And this is how I do things. I do really deep dives into data. And you get something that's pretty, controversial, and people can't stop thinking about it. So let's get right into it. I'm arguing that we are in the Bleeding Kansas period of the Second American Civil War. Now, I've interviewed about 200 plus professors of political science from around America, and I've talked to many of them. And what struck me as interesting was that many of them did not know about Bleeding Kansas. So when you talk to experts about political division, they're certainly aware of how bad things are now. And then they'll go, there was the Civil War. And they certainly know about the Civil War. But then when you ask them, how did things get so bad to the point that the Civil War happened? The answer seems to just fall on, slavery. Slavery was the inherent sin. This war was always going to happen. It was destined to happen. It was inevitable, couldn't be stopped. It was slavery. Slavery forced it. That's not true. That's just straight up not true. That's not how that happened. So what happened was something called Bleeding Kansas. Now, America had existed for a very long time. So America was born about 1790. We're looking at 1854. It had been around as a formative country for about 60, 70 years. And here's a map that shows you where the Bleeding Kansas period started, or the lead up to the Civil War. The lead up to the Civil War did not start in 1861 with the attack on Fort Sumter. It started in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I'm going to show you how things that look benign, boring, small, simple, insignificant were actually the things that led to 750,000 Americans being shot. The largest death toll. If you add every single war America's participated in, the Civil War is higher than all of those. So the death toll is just astounding. And I found that a lot of the experts in America on political division just really aren't aware of how that thing got started, other than kind of a grammar school understanding of slavery's bad. Okay. What happened was that slavery had been baked into the Constitution from day one. In fact, we don't like to admit this, but slavery was legal and it was constitutional, and everybody signed off on it. Now, today we like to act like all the Northerners were abolitionists. Not true. Only 2% of the North was abolitionists. Now, most of the North was what we call a free state, meaning they didn't want slavery, but it wasn't because they, loved African Americans and were upset about their plight. They felt that African Americans competed with white labor. So while they weren't for slavery, they weren't exactly civil rights heroes. 2% of the North was actually abolitionists, meaning they recognized what we all know today. Slavery is a horrible thing. At this point, though, now take a look to the left. You'll see the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory. When America illegally invaded Mexico in order to take its land from them under Manifest Destiny, they created California as a state, and then Utah Territory, New Mexico Territory. They let Utah and New Mexico decide if they wanted to be slave or a free state, and they let them have that vote. So the president at America at this time says, well, hey, we just let New Mexico and Utah become pick if they want to be a slave or free state. I know how to handle the slave-free state conflict. I'll let the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska vote, right? New Mexico and Utah got a vote. when America invaded Mexico, not a big problem. Why can't we let Kansas and Nebraska do the same thing? That was the thinking, that there's not much going to happen. It's not a problem if you let these states choose. Well, that was the thing. That single act, that policy, Kansas-Nebraska Act, is the thing that caused the entire Civil War. Straight up, this one policy. If they didn't do it, never would have been there. What happened was all the states that you see in the yellow are slave. All the states in green are free. And they said, whoever wins the vote in Kansas, you will determine if Kansas is going to be a free or slave state. Now, Nebraska pretty much was going to go free, and it was hard for people to get to. But Kansas was different. Kansas bordered the South and the North. And both the North and the South could easily get to Kansas. And both of them realized that they could turn this vote. And so what happened was you had a lot of Northerners and Southerners coming into Kansas and trying to shift the vote. And what they do is they rig an election. Let's see if we got a picture of that. So here's the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what happened was a lot of people in Missouri, which is right next to Kansas, who were Southerners, came into Kansas and rigged the vote. So here's a picture of that. These are a bunch of Missouri Southerners who came in. They flooded into Nebraska and really Kansas, and they basically rigged the vote. So like there might have been 1,000 people in the Kansas territory, and 6,000 votes were registered, all for the Southern candidate. So it was basically a rigged election. And that's what happened here. Now, because of that, you started a period of bloodshed that lasted basically right up to 1859. So you had Lawrence town being burned to the ground in 1856, the Osawatomie Massacre, the Potawatomi Massacre, the Mar de Sainans Massacre. We'll cover all those. But here's what you got to understand. And this is key to right now. This is why Charlie Kirk's assassination will directly lead to a second civil war. The map on the left shows you slave and free territories. The map on the right shows you population. So the map on the right is the population. As you can tell, the American population really only goes all the way out to Kansas. Yeah, there's some people in California on the West Coast, but really the dark brown and the map on the right is the American population. Kansas is at the frontier. It is at the edge of the known American space. So you have developed America, East Coast, southern states, and they kind of moved out, Kentucky, Tennessee, and then you're starting to get to Kansas, and this is Alaska. This is frontier. Nobody's been there. And so what happens is there's a bunch of violence in that frontier area in Kansas. The blue stars and the red stars show violence for liberals against conservatives and for conservatives against liberals, North versus South. And then you're going to have an event all the way back in the main population of America with the caning of a northern senator, which almost killed him in Washington, D.C., and the attack on Harper's Ferry, a federal installation, by crazy northerners named John Brown and his group, as they called it. And what you're going to notice is that the thing that caused the Civil War was not that people in the North and the South started to hate each other. It's that they became terrified that the other group would kill them. If you go back to 1853, this concept didn't really exist. 1854, Kansas-Nebraska Act happens. Now you have Southerners and Northerners going into Kansas, rigging votes. That causes tension. Within the next couple of years, they just start gunning each other down. Now, all of this is on the frontier. It's really far away from where most Americans are. It's on the Kansas border. So it seems extreme. But the telegraph exists and newspapers exist. So people throughout America in the North and the South are routinely getting these newspaper headlines of Northern man walked up to Southerner and shot him dead in front of his kids. Southern man executed 5 Northerners in cold blood and ran off, and the judge said it's cool. It just seemed completely wild. People would be walking up and shooting each other in the face. This is a little bit of the picture. Now, this is a depiction of an actual event in the Bleeding Kansas War. This is not a caricature. So literally you had people would walk up to someone's house and shoot the guy in the face in front of his wife and his kids, as the picture depicts. There's other people who are completely unarmed. Men come in horses and gun them down in the streets. And the thing is, there was no cops, there was no judges, so you could just murder somebody and then go home. And that was it. Nothing happened. So people got pretty upset about that and pretty riled up. So first we have the Fugitive Slave Act. Now we have, let's cover this. We have the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Okay, that created the tension and arms race between the North and the South. How do things really get started? Well, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1854 also really pissed off the North. So the North was basically allowing slaves freed from the South to come to the North and live for free. And they were kind of violating the Constitution as it was then. And the South really didn't like that. The South depended on slavery. And so slaves were escaping from the South and they were going to the North. And then the Northern communities were welcoming them in. And the slave communities in the South were going, hey, we're losing our slaves and you basically let it happen. Not cool. Now, horrible. But remember, at this time, the Constitution allowed slavery. And 2% of the country was abolitionist, actually against it for the sake of it being wrong. So the South creates a law. It forces a law on the North, where now Northerners must help capture runaway slaves. And if any Northerner is caught helping a runaway slave or aiding them, that Northerner can go to jail and be punished. So Northerners now saw that Southerners had control of the federal government and were forcing a law on them. You must capture runaway slaves, even if you hate the institution of slavery. And if you don't, we will throw you, a white man, in prison and punish you for helping the slave. That had never happened before. So yes, Northerners were helping slaves run away and they were kind of laughing at Southerners for it. But now there was a law saying you better do our Southern will or you get punished in a court of law. That really upset Northerners pretty damn bad. So now they're pissed. Okay, let's go to part two. The Kansas-Nebraska Act then. Northerners came in. Okay, here we go. In November 1855, here we go. Kansas was right on the border of Missouri, a known slave state. In 1855, Southerners crossed the border into Kansas and voted en masse to swing the Kansas election to allow a Southern-dominated government to form. The vote was rigged. People who did not live in Kansas moved in to vote, swing the election, and then moved back to Missouri. A pro-slavery government formed in Lecompton, Kansas. A Free State coalition rejected this rigged election and formed a separate government in Topeka. And here's how it gets worse. The president in 1856, President Pierce, recognizes the pro-slavery government and declares or condemns the Free State government as insurrectionist. Now, here's the thing. That was after Congress went and testified that it was a rigged election. So you have Southerners coming in and rigging the election. Then you have a group from Congress go out there, confirmed it's a rigged election. And then the president says, I don't care that it's a rigged election. I'm going to vote with the Southerners and they're in control. And these people who had an election rigged against them, you're insurrectionists and bad people. So now the Northerners are really like, wow, the Southerners have total control of the federal government. The Southerners don't even play by the rules with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And then the president says, we're the bad guys when we had the election rigged against them. You can kind of see how this is going. Then we have, okay. All right, in November of 1855, the first killing of the Civil War happened. A slavery-supporting settler shot a free state supporting settler in a matter of over personal debt. The men were not fighting over slavery. The local sheriff arrested another free state man instead of the Southern man who committed the murder. In response, free state supporters attacked the jail and freed the state prisoner and moved to Lawrence, Kansas, and formed a local militia to free the man. In response to that, on May 21st, 1856, only 6 months later, Southern supporters in Kansas and Missouri surrounded the town of Lawrence and burned it to the ground. And that's this. So the first death of the Civil War, and this is key. This is very key when you talk about the Charlie Kirk assassination. The first death of the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery at all. Two guys were pissed off at each other. They were just mad. And then if it ended there, you might not have even had the Civil War. What happened, though, the climate was so hot and people were hearing reports of injustice against the North and injustice against the South. And in this mix, this cauldron, a Southerner kills a Northerner. Now, nobody takes time to go, hey, everybody, this is just two guys and they had a personal. It's those evil Southerners will just murder Northerners. And then that's pretty bad. And that's what the newspapers do. To make it worse, local law enforcement arrests a Free State guy, not the Southerner who murdered the Northerner. So now the Northerners are looking at this going, hold on. A Southern guy can walk up to a Northerner, blow him away, and the local sheriff arrests a fellow Free Stater and lets the murderer go free. And this is after the president of America said, hey, the Southerners who rigged that election, they're the legitimate government. So you can see how if you're a Northerner, you're like, let me get this right. Southerners rigged the election. Then they have the president back them up after they know it's a rigged election. Then they execute a Northerner, and then the sheriff in the area excuses that Southerner from murder. So the Northerners frankly had enough, and they went and broke into the jail and freed that Southerner. And then they took him over to Lawrence, Kansas, and they basically made a free state city. Well, in response, the Southerners 6 months later went to Lawrence, Kansas. This is a drawing of Lawrence, Kansas, and burned it to the ground. You can see the buildings half collapsed and burned down. They basically destroyed the whole town. They destroyed the hotel. They destroyed the meeting place of the Free Staters. They destroyed kind of their hotel to let them know, you can't do this. And this comes back to this map. So on the right, you can see there's Lawrence. There's Lecompton and Topeka. Lecompton is the slave capital. Topeka is the Free State capital. Lecompton rigged the election, but they have control. Then Northerners move to Lawrence. Southerners come in and burn the place to the ground. Just burn it to the ground. Gone. Okay. Well, it didn't end there. On May 21st, Lawrence gets burned to the ground. On May 22nd, on the other side of the nation, this is the key part here. On the other side of the nation, on May 22nd, the very next day, in the urban capital of D.C., a northern senator was beaten to death, or beaten nearly to death, by a man from the South on the floor of the Senate. So let's go to that. So you have the sacking of Lawrence, okay? The next day, the very next day, boom, in Washington, D.C., Southerner beats a Northerner on the floor of the Senate to death, basically. He didn't die, but they didn't know that at the time. So the story goes, the Southerner beat him with a cane until the man basically stopped moving and his body was limp. And then he kept smacking him in the head and his body was bouncing up off the ground like limp. It looked like George Floyd, right? He basically was dead. Now, he wasn't, but his body's limp and he gets beaten for another 5 minutes. What's incredible is that nobody does anything. Nobody stops it. No police come. Nobody in the South condemns that senator for basically defiling the Capitol and almost killing a guy. In fact, what happens is he's celebrated. So the man who almost killed the other guy, the Southerner, newspapers across the South talk about how awesome he was for almost killing this Northerner in Congress. And they give him money and trinkets. So the Southern guy almost kills the Northerner in Congress, and there's people laughing, and those were Southerners. Nobody does anything, and then he's celebrated throughout the South, and nothing happens to him. So if you're a Northerner, you're like, hold on. Southerners can burn down an entire town of Northerners, and then the next day, Southerners can damn near kill a Northerner in Congress, and nobody does anything on top of this. And this is after Southerners have rigged an election and been recognized by the president and had one of their own imprisoned after a murder by a Southerner. So Northerners view this as just the South is completely lawless. They will murder them in cold blood. They'll do it anywhere. They'll do it on the far reaches of America. They'll do it right in the capital of America. This is the key part. When the violence was out in the frontier, that's fine. But now the violence came back to the capital. There's the caning. May 1856, big turning point for the North. Then on May 24th, in response to these actions, a free stater named John Brown led a group of Northerners and captured 5 slavery supporters in Kansas and then executed them in cold blood, blowing them away, etc. So I believe that was the Powhatan Massacre. And this is a picture of John Brown and some of the Northerners. So John Brown came in. He wasn't in Kansas. He heard about the violence. He came to Kansas, grabbed about 5 Southerners, and then shot them dead and also chopped off their arms. Like they had swords and they literally hacked them to death and shot them. And the key point I like this picture is it's just a few people. We're talking about 7 guys versus 5 guys. And this is what causes the Civil War, but it's so small, right? Now, John Brown does that. In response to that, Southerners form a militia and raid the town of Osawatomie, killing 5 Northerners and burning the anti-slavery town to the ground. So, Lawrence, the election is rigged. Lawrence is burned to the ground. Then you go to the Powhatan Creek Massacre, and John Brown murders 5 Southerners. Then the Southerners go to the Osawatomie city and kill 5 Northerners and burn it to the ground. Somewhere along the line, there's also the Mar de Seigneurs Massacre. This was also by John Brown or some of his followers. And that was where Northerners ran up on a couple Southerners and they just blew them away in cold blood. This is basically a depiction of people there. So those are Northerners on horseback with guns. The Southerners have no weapons. They're completely disarmed. They're neutral. And then they're shot and murdered. And that's the Mar de Seigneurs Massacre. So you can see 1856, Lawrence, Powhatan, 1856, Mar de Seigneurs, 1858. So about 1856 to 1858, people are just murdering each other left and right. And here's the key thing. Those are only the big killings. About 50 people total died in Bleeding, Kansas. We can track about 25 of the killings, but then there's another 25 people who just were found. So occasionally you just find a dead body, and it'd be a Southerner or a Northerner, and it'd be assumed that person was killed because they'd be shot, right? So we can only track so many of the killings, and then there's just random people who were in the wrong place and got killed. About a total of no more than 50 people. But then there's a period of random shootings, like dude just found dead, probably from a Northerner, probably from a Southerner. This goes on for a couple of years. So here we go. Let's get back to it. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Now, all this tension is going on, right? And all this murder. And then happens the Dred Scott case. Let's go to that. So Dred Scott was a man who was freed by his slave owner and gave him all the paperwork. But then the House didn't want him to be freed. So Dred Scott went to court and said, hey, I'm a free man. I have the paperwork. But then the family of the slave owner went and said, no, he deserves to be a slave again. And they basically fought this legal battle going back and forth, small court to the next court, to the next court, to the next court. It finally gets up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, which is stacked with Southern judges, says, okay, even though Dred Scott did everything legally correct, and he applied to the courts correctly, and he has the right paperwork, and it is the way the law works, we're going to make him a slave because he's black, and so we don't have to listen to him. So for Northerners, they had already been told, you better help us contain our slaves or we'll punish you. And we'll burn cities to the ground. And we'll execute your people. And we'll rig elections. And we'll have the government back them up. And now, even when a guy does everything right, we'll make sure the entire legal system can't work for him. By Southern judges. That's how the Northerners are viewing this. To the South, they felt the Dred Scott decision wasn't a big deal. The Constitution enshrined slavery. But to the North, they felt, wow, we lose everything. So finally, it gets even hotter. And now we go to this event. You probably heard about this, Harper's Ferry, 1859. John Brown, who'd been killing people left and right in Kansas, disappears for like a year or two. Suddenly, he reappears, boom, right next to Washington, D.C. He raids a military barracks and he has tons of guns. He has some ex-slaves with him, and he's going to go and give the guns to all the slaves in the area so they could lead a mass slave revolt and kill all the Southerners. And John Brown was pretty damn crazy, and he basically said, I'm down with killing all the Southerners. So there's a picture of the federal troops trying to break into the Army barracks. This terrified the South. Let's go to this map. The North is seeing Northerners get killed, cities burned to the ground. And then they see a Northerner almost die on the floor of the Senate, 1856. Then John Brown leads multiple raids in Kansas, killing Southerners, disappears, and then he pops up again on the other side of the country at Harper's Ferry, right next to Washington, D.C. So what happens now is people were looking at this event and saying, wow, that's on the frontier. That's so far away from us, and that's crazy. All those Southerners are killing Northerners. And in the South, they're like, that's crazy. Northerners killing Southerners. And maybe if it stayed there, it wouldn't happen. But then what happened was the craziness came home. People have been reading these stories year after year of anybody who's on my side gets murdered by the other side. Nobody does anything about it. And then a slave revolt happened in Virginia, a southern state, by the guy who was in Kansas. And then a northern senator was beaten nearly to death by a southerner in D.C. And so what happened was the violence from Kansas came home. And now people became terrified. And look, May 1856 was when Northerners felt terrified for their life. Lawrence was burned to the ground after a rigged election. And then a senator was beaten nearly to death in Congress in front of everybody, and nothing happened. They felt like the system was against them and the feds would not protect them. Now, fast forward to 1859, about 3 years later. The South had felt that Northerners would kill them, particularly John Brown. And now John Brown pops up again in a southern state and starts a war again. So if the battles had been in the far distant frontier, I don't think the Civil War would have happened. It was that things happened and then other things mirroring these things seemed to happen in their backyard. Harper's Ferry was the last straw. After that, the South basically invaded Fort Sumter. Now, here's the interesting thing. You could really say that the entire Civil War maybe happened just because of this one massacre. When John Brown killed in cold blood a bunch of Southerners, nobody had done anything like that before. So Southerners did sack the town of Lawrence, and they did rig an election, and they did arrest the wrong guy, and they did have the president back him and Boss Hogg kind of back him. But they hadn't killed anybody, right? They rigged elections, intimidated people, burned towns down, got the government to accept the rigged elections, but they hadn't murdered anybody. John Brown doesn't even live in Kansas. Hears about the violence and shows up and goes, I'm about it. And then he immediately takes it from here and moves it all the way up here by himself. Literally, him and his sons show up into a hotbed and take the temperature from here and raise it here by himself, one man. And all he did was kill 5 people. This is key. One man shows up and murders 5 people. And eventually you have the entire Civil War with 750,000 people killed. That's the key point. One man shows up in Kansas, violent, and he introduces killing, and he kills a bunch of Southerners. That's enough to start a chain of violence that continues throughout for a couple years, finishes up the Bleeding Kansas era, and then eventually leads to the Civil War. Now, you may find that a striking point, but it's the same thing as the Boston Massacre. In the Boston Massacre, which started the Revolutionary War, remember, the Americans weren't sure they wanted to fight the British until the Boston Massacre. That was the turning point when they realized that the English viewed them as others and were willing to murder them. The British were in the streets. There was a protest. The colonists were unarmed, and a bunch of regular troops fired into the crowd and murdered 5 people in cold blood. So only 5 Americans died during the Revolutionary War lead up, and that caused the Revolutionary War. That's Boston Massacre, basically. And it's supposedly it's because of one English lieutenant who was a little bit trigger happy. So one guy accidentally trigger happy, kills 5 people, starts the Revolutionary War. One guy trigger happy, shows up to Kansas, kills 5 people, starts the Civil War, basically, the lead up. And so how do we know that we can't do that again? Right? So you have one shooter shows up, and now we have the country tearing itself apart. So, for example, let's do this. When Charlie Kirk was killed, unfortunately, what happened was a lot of people on the left started celebrating. So here's some articles. Experts warn leftists celebrating of Charlie Kirk. Thousands flagged online for Charlie Kirk's celebrating his death. His assassination mocked. People are getting fired for celebrating Charlie Kirk, right. So, and then in return, the right gets upset and says, we will do vengeance. Stephen Miller and other people, J.D. Vance, were so offended by the liberal reaction to Charlie Kirk's murder that they were laughing about it, that they said, we'll do vengeance, we'll come and get you, it'll be retribution. Jesse Waters said this is war. J.D. Vance said the left is more predisposed to violence. And so what happened was you started getting into a conversation about, oh, is the left really supportive of more violence? Because that's what the right says. J.D. Vance says that. And hey, here's this other shooter. Trump had 2 previous assassination attempts, and they were both by liberals, right? That's the thinking. So when Charlie Kirk gets assassinated, it's not just him. It's that there were 2 assassination attempts on Trump that conservatives believed were by liberals. And then Charlie Kirk gets assassinated, and the conservatives say it's by liberals. So the way they're looking at it on the conservative side is Charlie Kirk got killed, liberals laughed about it, and liberals were the ones who tried to kill Trump. So liberals will try to kill the president, and they'll try to kill the president, and then they'll try to kill a top conservative speaker, and then they'll laugh about it. I would argue that conservatives today have entered the period of bleeding Kansas. So they could say that the harassment against them was pretty bad. But now they're saying liberals want to kill us. Liberals want us dead. Jesse Waters, J.D. Vance, Stephen Miller, and others. They want us dead. They want to kill us. So I think conservatives have gone through what the South went through with Harper's Ferry. You know, the South saw a lot of violence by the North, and they kind of were like, okay, that's there. But then Harper's Ferry happened, and they're like, oh my God, this is in our backyard. We're going to get killed tomorrow. Conservatives today are now where the South is after Harper's Ferry. They saw the assassination on Trump, and they thought the left did it. And they saw another one, and they thought the left did it. But it wasn't an assassination attempt on them. And then Charlie Kirk was not a politician, and he was killed, and the left celebrated. And so now they feel the left will kill us. They'll murder us. And so I'd argue that we've entered into the bleeding America period because the right believes that the left will try to kill them. And they thoroughly believe that. But here's the other thing. The left had already gone into the period where they felt the right was trying to kill them. January 6th. January 6th happened. It terrified the left. Many people thought the country was being stormed. And what's worse was that about a year after January 6th, the right started walking it back. About a year after January 6th, they're going, yeah, you know, we didn't really storm the Capitol. We didn't really hurt anybody. We weren't really trying to hurt anybody. It's all just garbage. That shocked the hell out of the left. As much as January 6th shocked people, the Republican walking back condemnation of January 6th is really what pushed it over the top. So all of this has been to say, when January 6th happened and then it was refuted or backed down condemnation by the Republicans, that was the moment where liberals said they will kill us. After 2 Trump assassination attempts and then finally Charlie Kirk's successful assassination attempt, now the conservatives are saying they will kill us. If you go back to 1854 to 1859, it wasn't until the Northern senator was almost killed in the Senate that after Lawrence was burned to the ground that caused the North to get upset. And it wasn't until Harper's Ferry, after John Brown had already murdered multiple Southerners, that caused them to be upset. It wasn't just one event. It was two events, one on this side of the country and then one on the other side. And they said, it's coming to my home. It's coming to me. So now I hear tons of conservatives talking about how the left hates us, they want to kill us, and they're trying to get us. And it reminds me of where the left was the year after January 6th, or a couple of years, when they were like, hold on, January 6th, we thought we were going to be killed, and now the right walks it back. Wow. To add some fuel to the fire, there's a new poll that came out recently, and it shows that people now think that the country is too politically divided to come together. It happened very recently. So this poll was taken between September 22nd to 27th, 2 weeks after Charlie Kirk was assassinated. When Democrats asked whether they think Republicans as the enemy or fellow Americans whom they disagree with politically, only 10% chose the harsher description, a modest decline from last year. Before the 2024 election, polls showed that people were more likely to identify issues such as inflation, abortion, immigration as the most important to their vote. Polarization barely registered. Today, spasms of political violence have erupted across, and now polarization is much higher. So between July 22nd and October 22nd, the country went from about half think we can fix it and half we don't, to a clear 2/3 majority now thinks we can't fix it. And let's go into details. Here's the bylines from that. It's not just one side. So who thinks it's too divided to solve those problems in dark gray? Democrats, 67%, Republicans, 57%, independents, 70%. So for liberals and independents, it's basically 70%, and for conservatives, it's 60%. All those are 2/3. If you want to look at regions, Midwest, 70%, Northeast, 60, South, 60, West, including California, 70%. So again, 2/3 of every region and 2/3 of every party all feel that America's past being able to come back together. Let's look at ethnic groups. 64% of whites, 76, almost 80% of blacks, 69, 70% of Latinos, and almost 60% of other. So for African Americans, it's like 80% chance. And for white people, it's 65%. Looking at age ranges, it's 63 to a high of 71% across all age ranges. Between men and women, it's 64 and 64%. So if you're Republican, Democrat, male, female, old, young, whatever, live in the Midwest, mid to the South, 2/3 of you now think from the last 2 weeks alone, America can't be healed and come back together. Striking? Well, not when you consider this poll. This is from 2021, just a few years ago. Clear and present danger. Majority of Trump voters believe it's time to split the country in two. That was September 2021. Came from a study by the University of Virginia. New initiative explores deep, persistent divides between Biden and Trump on September 30th, that same year. Now, here's the two questions that I found very intriguing. This is from the survey there. Of Biden voters, 80% said, I have come to view elected officials from the Republican Party as a clear and present danger. 75% of Biden voters said, I believe that Americans who strongly support the Republican Party have become a clear and present danger too. For Trump voters, 84% said all Democratic officials are a clear and present danger. 78% of all Trump voters said all Democrats are a clear and present danger. So I see this poll going, hey, don't worry. There's only about 14% or 10% of Republicans or Democrats who think the other guys are really bad guys. That's their poll. Here's this poll showing it's 80%, basically, of all Trump voters think all Democrats are bad and all Democratic voters are evil. And all Democrats, 80%, think all Republicans are bad and all Republican officials. That's 3 years ago. By the way, University of Virginia is a very reputable school. So I don't buy this line on it's only a 10%, 14%. I buy this because if you're already thinking about 3/4 of each side of the country thinks the other side's an existential threat, then it would make sense that only about 3 years later, you'd be thinking when somebody's murdered and people laugh about it, we can't come together. And so that's what I'm saying. We've gotten to this point now where people now feel we can be killed by the other side. Liberals felt that with January 6th and with the Republicans walking it back. And now the circle is complete. Conservatives now feel the same of leftists. Now, violence is bad, and I'm not saying either side's out to kill the other. I'm simply comparing history to now. And I'm saying that the thing that caused the Civil War was not slavery. It was a bad policy decision that aggravated the situation and put people in direct conflict. Then there was lawlessness, property destruction, and straight up cold-blooded shooting of people with no law coming to the territory. The interesting thing about Bleeding Kansas was that it was quiet, mostly during the Civil War. The federal government sent a governor to there who said, I don't want you to be biased to the South or the North. If somebody breaks the law, you throw them in prison. This governor got there, and within 3 months, the whole thing had died down. Why? Because this governor, who was from the South but said, I'll be fair, was arresting Northerners and Southerners and placing them in jail. Within 3 months, the whole thing dissipated. So you had 5 years of people going wild, killing each other, wild stories. Within 3 months of a new sheriff, the governor coming and going, I will arrest everybody who violates the law. I will prosecute everyone who's unfair. It was gone. Like the rebels on both sides took off and it dried up. That's the point. The moment that safety came back and people thought there was law and that they would be protected under the law equally, the whole thing dried up. The previous 5 years, you had rigged elections, sheriffs favoring people, murderers going free, towns being burned down, murderers killing each other left and right every day, and no law and order to it at all. Well, of course it was chaotic. There was no fairness. There was no referee, no neutral person. So now it's on my side better win against your side because it's all about winning, and they can do whatever they want. Within 3 months of a governor coming and saying, no, you can't, there's law and order, whole thing died. So my question is, I look at this poll of division and I don't see us coming to a period of law and order and saying, you know what, we're going to get a new president in there and a new Congress, and they're going to be fair to the left and the right. The left and the right are so polarized they can't be fair to each other. And so how close are we to a second civil war, given that emotionally, I'm arguing we've hit the same point that the South and the North did. And that these were the events that actually caused them to feel like it's okay to start killing each other en masse. And that now we're going through the same thing. The cycle is complete. Both sides are in on it now. And to make it even a little bit scarier, remember, only 5 people died in each event at the start. The Bleeding Kansas period was no more than 50 people total. So the Civil War was 750,000. More than 50. Here's where it gets scary. Violence is wrong and bad. Pulse nightclub, about 50 to 60 dead. Virginia Tech, about 50 to 60 dead. Las Vegas shooting, about 50 to 60 dead. One guy in each situation. One guy shows up, kills 50 to 60. Bleeding Kansas levels. One guy shows up in Virginia, one guy shows up in Vegas. So that's Florida, that's Virginia, that's Las Vegas. All across America, different places. One guy shows up and does this mass killing. Now, the reason why these didn't go any further was that all these people were declared to be crazy. You know, they were just whack jobs. And one of them was ISIS, but they were all whack jobs. What if there's a Pulse nightclub shooting and the guy says, I did it because they're all liberals? What if there's another Las Vegas shooting and the guy says, I did it because they're all conservatives? It took 50 people total in Bleeding Kansas to create the level of bloodlust to get 750,000 people killed. How do we know that when the television broadcasts one guy who unalives 50 people for politics, which has never happened in America before since Bleeding Kansas, won't kick this off to the next level? How do we know that? Violence is wrong and bad. history has lessons perhaps for the entire country to learn. We'll leave it there. Thank you.